Thank you for joining us this evening. I am Jennifer Dye. I'm a librarian at Detroit Public Library. We've had a strong program with the League of Women Voters Detroit for over 2 years now. We present on issues of concern to Michigan voters about 10 months of the year. You were brought into this program muted. Please put any questions into the chat. Ruth Coolwine will capture these questions and ask them at the end of the presentation. We might be able to allow people to unmute at the end to ask questions directly if time allows. This presentation will be recorded and it will be made available on DPL's and the Detroit League's websites. Deborah Bunkley, acting president of the League of Women Voters Detroit, will speak about the League and the Detroit group. And I think I saw that Deborah come in, didn't she?
I have not seen her yet. But
all right, I'm sorry, I was watching. All right, thank you, Cheryl.
I will speak. My name is Cheryl Bookoff, and I'm a member of the board of the League of Women Voters Detroit. Just to tell you, we are a nonprofit.
All right, Deborah is apparently using Susan Slattery's.
Okay.
And so I will unmute you.
Great.
And let you turn on your camera if you would like to.
I don't know. I didn't okay, you should be able to see me. Yep.
Hello.
Hi, Deborah Bunkley. I'm at Susan's house. Sorry. Okay. Let me just, I apologize. I just want to first of all say democracy is not a spectator sport. I like to start with that and I like to end with it. The League of Women Voters of Detroit encourages, informs, and active participation in government. We envision a democracy where every person has the desire, the right, the knowledge, and the confidence to participate. We are local, state, and federal. And I'll say it again. We are not, democracy is not a spectator sport. And I will hand this back to Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Our speaker tonight is Peter J. Hammer, director of the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights, which is embedded in Wayne State University's law school. The Keith Center's mission is to promote the educational, economic, and political power of underrepresented communities in urban settings. Dr. Hammer is co-author with Edward J. Littlejohn of No Equal Justice, the legacy of civil rights icon George W. Crockett Jr. Tonight, he will examine some of the current and recent changes to voting rights and democracy, with a particular focus on Michigan. Dr. Hammer, thank you for joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you for the invitation from the League. It's always a pleasure to be able to work with the library, one of my favorite institutions. So I'm going to try to do my screen sharing and see how effective I can be in getting the PowerPoint up and running for everybody. Okay, that's a good first step. And then if I go to display settings, I think everybody should be able to get a good view of what's going on. So voting rights and democracy, right? And very core to the mission that you were describing. I always like to start my presentations with a shout out to Judge Keith. Judge Keith passed in 2019 at the age of 96. Voting rights was one of the most important things he was passionate about. And you'll see in the presentation, I'll be speaking more about the judge as part of our effort to carry on the life and legacy of Judge Keith at the center. So I want us to start thinking about voting rights and democracy together, right? In ways that we may not have thought before. We never talk about democracy without talking about voting rights. And I really think that's a traditional approach. And I want us to start thinking of never talking about voting rights without talking about democracy. And I think that's one of our more urgent needs. And you'll see as we talk about democracy and voting, where that's going to be fitting in the presentation. So this is kind of the quick overview of the time that we'll be spending together and sort of priming your mind to be thinking about how these things are associated. I'm going to start with a discussion about the public sphere. And from that discussion, we'll distill out the facts that facts and truth are actually fairly fragile entities, and communities are fragile, right? And those are, again, building blocks in my mind of democracy. I'll then talk about what I call the first generation, which is an attack on voting rights, and the second generation of activities, which is really an attack broader on democracy. And then I'll telescope back into Michigan and find out what's happening in Michigan, both with respect to voting rights, but also with respect to a basic defense of democracy. So let's talking about the public sphere. And for some, this is kind of a quaint, old-fashioned idea. But I want it to be the frame that we use to think about voting and democracy. And here's a couple of definitions to get us on a common ground of what the public sphere actually is. So the public sphere, the term the public sphere, also called the public forum or public arena, may be understood as the totality of human society in its public dimension, and more precisely, the specific realm between the private life and the political structures governing society. So think about anything between the private life that you have and government, that is the whole sphere of the public sphere, right? The public sphere is brought into expression in realms of general human interaction in civil society, both at the level of daily life in person, in the bodily presence of culture, religion, social and political communities, as well in the world in which we live today, the digital life, right? Or the digital communications and the shared social life that is experienced in this digital realm. This public sphere shapes our democracy, right? So the public sphere is also the place where the self-understanding of modern democracies are both self-consciously internalized and externally enacted. So the public sphere is the activity, the sort of raw materials, the energy, the opinions, the discourse that then inform democracy and public action. Here's some other sort of dimensions of it. The public sphere has an epistemological dimension. That's just a fancy word.
Excuse me, Dr. Hammer, should the slides be advancing?
Yes, they should. They're not?
They are not.
All right, so let's go back and try this from the very beginning. So my apologies, this is not our technology night. So I'm going to try to screen share again, if I can find screen share. All right. I'm going to go back to the slideshow. I'm going to start from the beginning where you were all stuck. See if we go from the beginning. All right. And tell me if the slides are moving now. So I'm moving first time. Do people see a picture of Judge Keith?
Yes.
All right. And these are the materials I passed through. So we're back now into the public sphere. And I was on this slide. So people are seeing a slide that says public sphere epistemology.
Yeah.
All right. I love it when we're all together. So if anything else messes up, just pause in and interrupt and we'll all get back on the same page. All right. The public sphere is where we produce knowledge, right? So it's the space where different opinions are expressed, problems are discussed, collective solutions are developed and communicated. But then we can add on layers of expectations of the public sphere. And one expectation by Jason Stanley, who's a political philosopher out of Yale, is one of public reasonableness. And that's a responsibility that we take into account the reasonable perspectives of all those citizens subject to policy under debate. And one aspect of the public sphere we can have an expectation for is that of empathy, that one can expect. He was dealing with propaganda at that time. He's expecting a form of propaganda that can be a claim that is represented as reasonable, but has the effect of eroding empathy for targeted groups. So things that undermine empathy are things that also disrupt and undermine the public sphere. I've switched sides. Are people seeing now a simple version of the public sphere?
Yes.
Okay, so we're working. So that's sort of fancy philosopher talk. I want to make this very simple, right? You can think about the core elements of the public sphere as having common enough facts, truth, history, narratives, values, and belief, right? Remember that old saying that you're entitled to your own opinion, but not your own facts? That's a reflection of how I'm envisioning this public sphere acting, right? So we have common enough facts, right? But we also have common enough forms of community. And if we flip those things on their head, we see some of the threats to the public sphere and therefore threats to democracy. And we start to realize the fragility of truth and facts, right, as well as the fragility of community. And those sources of fragility are going to be undermining the strength and viability of our democracy. So what do I mean by thinking about facts as fragile, right? Think about how polarized our media is, right? When you were growing up, nobody was talking about fake news. Yet we have a conservative talk radio. We have conservative media outlets like Fox News. We have misinformation and disinformation coming through social media. And there's a book by Yochai Benkler called Network Propaganda, where he maps out the polarization and persuasively documents that the polarization is asymmetrical. The polarization that's taking place on the right is far more extreme than the polarization that's taking place on the left, right? And I'm just trying to report out what the research is finding. So we have polarized media. We also have what I'm going to call a counter-enlightenment trend. And this is manifested many places, but one place this is manifest is in notions of Christian nationalism. Right. And when I mean counter-enlightenment, think about the Enlightenment views you were taught, and think about the values and the alleged truths that are being propagated here. At one level, it's anti-historical, right? The claim is that America was founded as a Christian nation. It's anti-science, as well as sort of being anti-elite and being sort of very populist in its orientation of where truth comes from. So in that respect, they can deny evolution, they can deny climate change, right, in the sort of counter-enlightenment trends. But it's also very anti-public schools, right, favor of privatizing public education, the fights that you've seen on the news about so-called critical race theory or CRT, the fights over the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida, the fights over sort of transphobia. All of that is sort of the stream that we're having in undermining truth and facts in this notion of a counter-enlightenment trend. And then finally, this kind of environment where there are no truths, there are no facts, is rife with conspiracy theories, right? You can kind of name your favorite conspiracy theory on InfoWars or QAnon. These are all interrelated effects, and they're all aspects that are undermining the truth element, the fact element of the public sphere. But it's not just truth that's under attack. The notion of a common community in America is also under attack, and it's under attack on many different levels. At one level, we're facing income inequality that's as extreme as any time in our history since 1929, right? So one thing that's sort of stressing communities and pulling communities apart is income inequality. We have changing national demographics, right? Where we'll soon be what the experts call, and I hate this word, but it's the word that we use, a majority minority country, but a changing racial demography. We have rising notions of white supremacy and white nationalism. We have, in my belief, increasing racism. We have anti-Blackness. We have all sorts of othering going on, whether that's religious othering, racial othering, othering in terms of gender and sexual orientation. Right? These are all happening at the same time. We have extreme geographic sorting, right? Sorting of red versus blue, sorting of urban versus rural, sorting of people who shop at Whole Foods versus people who shop at Walmart, right? And there's an important book by Ann Case and Angus Deacon called Deaths of Despair. And what they document is really the collapse of the economic and civil society for a lot of white working class Americans. And they correlate that with dramatic increases in suicide, dramatic increases in addiction that's underlying the opioid crisis. And what you actually see in white America is a falling a life expectancy, right? So there's deeper causes here than just what you're going to be hearing on talk radio. But the underlying point is that we have a fracturing of this a public sphere that's critical for democracy. It's fracturing on lines of what we identify as being true or false, and it's fracturing on the lines of what we define as our communities. So deep breath, right? That's your sort of philosophical orientation of the public sphere as it relates to democracy. I want to go through what I call the first attack, and that's the attack on voting rights. And to do this, I'm going to pull from a case that Judge Keith wrote a dissent in 2016, when he was only 93 years young. And the case was a Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless versus Houston, right? And I'm going to use this really as a parable of voter suppression. And by telling you the story of the case in your own mind, you spend your life thinking about voting and voting rights. You're going to see that what happened in Ohio is played out in Michigan. What's happened in Michigan is playing out nationally. But I want it to be in the judicial forum, and I want Judge Keith to be our primary guide through this, because you're also going to hear his views about voting and democracy. And I think at times of crisis, you need elders and heroes. And Judge Keith is one of the better heroes that we can be looking up to when it comes to voting rights. All right, so what was the underlying dispute? In 2014, Ohio adopted a series of laws that, among other things, required county election boards to reject ballots and absentee and provisional voters whose identification on the envelopes contained an address or birth date did not exactly match the voting records, right? And it's kind of the notion of exact matching that's important here. They reduced the number of post-election voting days that voters had to cure any identification problems from 10 days to 7 days. And they restricted the ways in which poll workers can help in-person voters, right? And you might say that for, 80% of the population, not a big deal. But the plaintiffs in this case was a coalition of homeless voters, right? And groups advocating on their behalf. 70% of their membership of in-person homeless applicants were African Americans. So we sort of see that the racialization of homelessness as we see the racialization of poverty. We see that they're promoting voting, this organization of its members as central. They're trying to get the homeless to vote. They're trying to feel them as the mission of the League of Women Voters, to be empowered, to have the power and franchise to vote. And in this context, remember the fragility of communities, right? That the public sphere should include the homeless. And when we try to target the homeless, we're reducing that level of empathy that's necessary to have a robust form of democracy. All right, and Judge Keith then, as he's giving the background of the case, tells you the history since 2010 of this first wave of attack on voting. Right? He says, following the 2010 election, control over the Ohio House of Representatives switched from Democrat to Republican. And if you remember, this was very much a racialized backlash where the Tea Party was symbolically emblematic of the election of the first African-American president in 2008. And we'll come back to that. So they switch in the sort of backlash election, and then rather quickly after the change in leadership, the House Republicans introduced two bills. One was going to require a voter ID law for all people in the state, right? The other was an expansive election law bill that had just a Christmas tree ornament-filled list of voter restrictions, right? And if you remember, the Ohio populace, through a voter referendum, was going to take all of that apart. Right. So after there was Ohio signed petitions to put this on the ballot referendum, and we'll get to the Michigan ballot referendums later, the legislature pulled back. Right. So the voters were expressing their desire for democracy. The legislature repeals one of those earlier laws. But it doesn't stop in 2012. In 2013, they proposed 16 additional bills. 8 of those bills passed in 2014. Right. And one of those bills that passed was to shorten the window to gather signatures for voter referendum. Right. So they're trying to make it harder for voters to put referendum on the ballots that actually might provide greater voter protections. Right. And again, this is Ohio, but you can hear the echoes across the border in Michigan. Right. All right. So another bill was passed trying to make it easier to purge voter rolls. There was a bill that was passed to eliminate the first week of early voting periods. And in this process, there was no testimony about voter fraud, right? And to me, this is the other big lie. All these bills are being passed, right, to suppress the vote, to make it harder to vote in order to protect allegedly the integrity of the voting process. And yet there's no evidence of voter fraud. So back that notion of fragility of facts about truth and falsehood, there isn't a voter problem in this country, and yet the allegation of voter fraud is being used to support a lot of these voter suppression efforts. Right? And during committee debate, Representative Matt Huffman, speaking in favor of the bill that is at issue in the case in the Sixth Circuit litigation, says, should we really be making it easier for those people, right? And we've all heard the use of those people before, who take the bus after church on Sunday to vote, right? So you're getting this notion that this is a racialized campaign trying to make it harder for some people to vote and not making it harder for all people to vote. All right, so that's the background, the sort of effort to be passing tons of legislation to suppress the vote. So the particular issue here was whether or not the laws that I identified earlier to match the envelopes and check the voter identification and prevent poll workers from helping people, That was litigated as a violation both of equal protection and of the Voter Rights Act, right? So now we're shifting gears and thinking about this through the lens of a district court judge. So we now have Judge Keith on the appellate court telling us exactly what the district court found as a matter of fact, right? So we're also pulling through our theme about truth and fact and how we know things. And we'll find out first what the district court held as a quote unquote matter of fact. The district court concluded that many homeless people face vexing and profound obstacles in exercising the basic right to vote, and that prohibitions against poll worker assistance is likely to exacerbate the problems. So the things that 80% of the people might be able to do with no problem, for some percentage of the homeless population become really insurmountable barriers to be able to vote. And they're the ones who are going to be most disparately impacted by this problem. The district court's findings of fact, and just remember the underlining, findings of fact, were the product of several years of litigation and a 12-day bench trial. The findings were supported by statistical, empirical, and testimonial evidence after research was conducted regarding thousands of voters on several years of voting cycles. These findings of fact are critical in analyzing the claims brought pursuant to the Voting Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause, right? And again, these are further findings of fact. And what the Judge Keith always did was outline the facts, right? And then apply the law to the facts. Further findings of fact from the district court judge. African Americans were hindered from participating in the political process, right? Ohio has a history of racially discriminating voting laws. Racial polarized voting in Ohio is extensive. There are racialized appeals in politics. African Americans are still not represented well in the most important and visible elected statewide posts. There is a lack of responsiveness to the particularized needs of African American voters, right? And this is not my opinion, it's not Judge Keith's opinion. These are the particular findings of fact of a district court judge after holding evidentiary hearings, right? Now, the typical, this is now you're getting your law school lesson, the typical what they call standard of review from a district court's findings of fact is what they call as a clearly erroneous standard. That the appellate court is supposed to accept those facts as true as long as those facts are not clearly erroneous, which is a very, very high standard to try to cross. And yet the majority in this case, and this is Judge Keith arguing against the majority, was that they largely ignored those findings of fact by applying a de novo standard of review, which is a fancy way of saying that the appellate court would make its own findings of fact, right? And again, what we see is that fragility of truth we talked about earlier that you might find on Fox News is also now finding its way in the judiciary, right? And so a place where we would think that findings of fact and truth would have a particularly strong weight, we're finding that judges are playing fast and loose about truth and facts at the appellate court level in the Sixth Circuit, which covers Michigan as well as Ohio, and that's what Judge Keith is speaking out against. In essence, and this is my language, not Judge Keith's language, the majority opinion manipulated the district court's findings of fact to make the equal protection voting rights claim disappear. All right. And nothing got Judge Keith angrier than protecting voting rights or seeing voting rights infringed. Right. So this is language by Judge Keith. And part of the reason I shared is sort of that notion of inspiration about a clear understanding of the importance of voting rights historically. So this is Judge Keith's language in defense of voting rights. Right. He said the birth of this nation was founded upon the radical principle that we as a people would govern ourselves. And voting is the ultimate expression of self-governance. Instead of making it easier for persons unrestrained and unfettered to exercise this fundamental right to vote, legislatures are making it harder. States are audaciously nullifying the right for which our ancestors relentlessly fought, and in some instances tragically died. Right? And again, more of Judge Keith of analysis. He says, for years, states have been both stealthily and overtly erecting hurdles to the right to vote. And the votes of those who are actually able to surmount those hurdles are often diluted through gerrymandering. These states' actions of implementing rules and redrawing districts in an effort to restrict minorities' access to the ballots is another reminder that history repeats itself, right? And he has his mind what happened to the 15th Amendment. He has his mind what happened with the poll taxes. He has a mind that's saying that history never ends. We have to constantly be vigilant against that. He said, it is another reminder that many people hold the misguided belief that only the privileged majority should be granted access to political power and adequate representation. Right? You can also sort of hear almost the anger that he was holding in coming out in his words. Right? He says another important historical occurrence that cannot be separated from the efforts to abridge minority rights to vote is the election of the United States' first Black president. With every gain in equality, there is often an equally robust and reactive retrenchment. We must never forget that constant dialectical tension. For every action, there's a reaction. The majority's decision is a fateful reminder that we can never fool ourselves into believing that we have arrived as a nation. And I love that introductory remark that the democracy is not a spectator sport. And what Judge Keith is telling us is we might think that we've won, we might think that we protected democracy, but democracy and voting rights are always under a threat. All right, so how do you go from being a lonely dissenter to being a national news story because this opinion got national news story? Judge Keith was going to make sure that he put this in historical context. And he actually reproduced in his dissent the photographs and the biographies of over 24 people who died in the struggle for civil rights, for voting rights, right? And he places that decision in this historical context. He says the majority's action must be viewed in full light of the historical context. The murders of countless men and women who struggled for the right to vote and equal protection cannot be overlooked. The other brutality of white supremacy, and the judge was always using the language that needed to be used, the utter brutality of white supremacy in its efforts to disenfranchise persons of color is the foundation for the tragedy of this majority's effort to roll back the progress of history. He says, I will not forget. I cannot forget. Indeed, America cannot forget the pain, the suffering, the sorrow of those who died for equal protection and for this precious right to vote. I add the following publicly available historical statements to humanize the struggle for the right to be equal participants in the democratic process. It is imperative that we assess the efforts to undermine the right to vote as the historical operative that did not begin with a majority opinion and unfortunately will not end with it. All right, and I'm just showing you one example of the tribute in the opinion published in the Federal Reporter to Medgar Evers, right, who died in 1963 in Mississippi in the drive to register voters, right? And this opinion, this dissent of the judge in 2016, right, on the eve of the election, became national news as the judge was fighting at the age of 93 for the integrity of voting rights against this first wave that I'm talking about. Obviously not the first wave historically, but the first wave in our kind of last 15 years of attacking the vote and attacking democracy. So that's a lot. I appreciate you kind of still being here with me. So deep breath, right? That's a lot, this first generation attacking voting, but we're now going to look what happened since 2016, and we're going to see more extreme and direct attacks on democracy. And this will be shorter, right? I want to get us to Michigan pretty quickly. And again, this is out of the headlines that we see, right? You have the new big lie, right, which is a false allegation that voter fraud and election changed the election outcome in 2020. You had top Trump officials plotting what is in reality a coup, the first time that's happened in our history. You had state efforts not to certify election results. You had state efforts to enroll fake electors. You had claims that the vice president could decertify the election. And then you had the symbolic culmination in the January 6th insurrection, right? But these are not isolated, as the judge said. These are ongoing efforts to undermine democracy. In some respects, may only be the tip of the iceberg. But we have to be smart, right? We can read the headlines, we can condemn the actions, which we should, but we have to start getting deeper into the mindset that is driving the cause. And that's why I was talking earlier about the public sphere and the implications on community and the implications on basic truth and basic facts, right? So here's an effort to try to think about what causes the mentality, which I call sort of epistemic tribalism, that's driving some of this opposition. So these are the elements that you find in epistemic tribalism. You have what cognitive psychologists call the confirmation bias at individual level. Everything I hear, I interpret to confirm the things I already believe. At a group level, that's called the conformity bias. And when you combine the confirmation and the conformity bias, you're having the building blocks of the sort of tribal epistemic tribalism, right? It's believing is belonging, right? It's the tribe that I'm with determines my beliefs. It's not my interpretation of facts independently. My politics are informed by my identity and not by interest, right? And when that happens, when politics is driven by identity and not interest, very, very hard to have a conversation with people, very, very hard to change minds, right? You have what psychologists call identity protective cognition, that I consciously are avoiding stories or narratives that are inconsistent with what I believe. I'm constantly trying to hear stories that are confirming my beliefs. It is very kind of team and identity based. Therefore, I need an other, right? So othering and sort of these aspects of racialization are part of this dynamic. There are obvious in groups. That means there's obvious out groups. There's an us. That means there has to be a them, right? And so much of what happens in the human mind is not driven by rational thought. So much is driven by emotion. So much is driven by our socialization. So much is driven by our culture. And that now is being directed in ways that are highly detrimental to democracy, right? So reminding us what we were talking about the public sphere, in many respects, there's a collapse of this public sphere in this attack on democracy. There's no common factual basis for discourse and decision-making. There's a collapse of public reason. We have an inability to authentically listen to and consider the points of view of others, right? We're not even open to hearing opposing points of view. There's a collapse of empathy. It was the homeless who are being attacked. We're vilifying the homeless and denying them the right to vote. That's, again, that kind of notion of tribalism and othering, targeting out groups, such as what happened in Ohio, right? And this is also very fertile ground for those non-rational beliefs, right? Those conspiracy theories that we were mentioning earlier, right? And this is really fodder, sort of symbolically, to trying to understand the hysteria that was unleashed on January 6th. But that didn't go anywhere, right? So I just want us to be reminding ourselves we are still having to wrestle with this collapse of the public sphere, these attacks on democracy, and thinking about what that means for our democratic future. All right, so we're landing the plane, right? We're coming back home. We're going to try to see what's happening in Michigan. And I can tell you a lot of great things have happened in Michigan in just the last number of years, right? And I think that we are actually exhibiting national leadership on how to protect the vote, how to lay the foundation of preserving democracy. But I want to remind us that voting requires an infrastructure, right? And that we have to think about what that infrastructure looks like. You need workable notions of districts, right, as building blocks. And we know that that's threatened by gerrymandering. You need workable mechanics of the voting process, right? And that's undermined by these threats of voter suppression. But we also need workable systems of democratic information. And something we don't talk enough about and we haven't made progress on is what's the information ecosystem? The collapse of local news is really a threat to democracy when we don't have local reporters reporting on local issues in ways that are going to be informing the information base necessary for constructive voting. All right, through voter-led initiatives, right? The same things that led to the Ohio legislature to change its vote, the same thing that led in Ohio and Michigan for efforts to make it harder to get voter-led initiatives. Three important voter-led initiatives have created the infrastructure for voting in Michigan at the constitutional level that is far more robust than it was even 5 years ago. And in that way, again, that we're really leading the nation in important respects. One of those voter-led initiatives was the Michigan Independent Citizen Redistricting Commission, right? Its mission is to lead Michigan's redistricting process to assure Michigan congressional, state Senate, House, state House district lines are drawn fairly in a citizen-led, transparent process, meeting constitutional mandates. Right, the vision is to chart a positive course for the elections based on fair maps of Michigan today and in the future. Right, trying to take the politics out of redistricting. In 2008, and I'm talking to the crowd, the people, many people who probably worked very hard to make these things happen. So I want to acknowledge that in the presentation. That in 2018 we had Proposal 3. which is going to say that you can become automatically registered to vote when applying for or renewing a driver's license. You could simultaneously register to vote with proof of residency and obtain a ballot during the 2 weeks prior to the election, up to and including election day. You could obtain an absentee voter without providing a reason. And you could cast these straight voter tickets, right? These were essential in trying to just put safeguards in democracy and voting into the Constitution. And then just in 2020, we passed Proposal 2 to amend the state constitution with a whole raft of ways to protect the vote, recognizing the fundamental right to vote without harassing conduct, requiring military and overseas ballots to be counted if postmarked by election day, providing voter rights to identify with a photo ID or signed statement, provided road rights to single application to voter absentee in all elections, which I just did. So I'm set, hopefully, for a long period of time. Require state-funded absentee ballot drop boxes, provide that only election officials may conduct post-election audits, which we've seen happen elsewhere, require 9 days of early in-person voting, allow donations to fund elections to be disclosed, and require canvass boards certify election results based only on the official records of the vote cast, right? So deep sigh of relief. Congratulations to all of you who are listening, who were part of the process that made that possible. We get an A grade for protecting voting in Michigan. We're not doing so well in protecting democracy, right? So I'm giving us a statewide grade of D, right? We had the conspiracy to kidnap and kill our governor, right? We had Michigan's effort to produce a slate of fake electors in 2020. We had Trump-backed litigation to challenge election results on legal theories that had no foundation and no basis. We had fights over certification with local election results. We had efforts to intimidate Wayne County election workers. We had efforts to intimidate the Secretary of State at her home. And you sort of ask this question with all of these threats to democracy, who wants to be a poll worker, right? We're really going to have to sort of think through the very infrastructure that I said earlier that voting requires. So I want to save time for questions and have time that we can actually have a healthy discussion. But let's think a little bit about where we go from here, right? I really believe we're still at a diagnostic stage to really understand the democratic crisis we face. To really understand the depth of the psychology underlying it, the depth of the collapse of fact and truth, the depth of the polarization of communities at many different levels. And I think there's got to be a lot of further discussion and diagnosis to define what the problem is so we can take effective action. I really do believe that going back to that foundational notion of a public sphere, that space between the private space and the public governance, and thinking about the implications of the need for truth in that setting, the need for community in that setting, and what can we do to rebuild truth and facts? What can we build to revitalize communities, right? But I always say that you have a whole lot better chance of succeeding if you know what you're fighting for. And what we're really fighting for, and again, I'm thinking about the legacy of Judge Keith and his generation of heroes who fought for voting rights and many of who died for voting rights. We're fighting for a healthy, pluralistic, multicultural democracy, right? A healthy, pluralistic, multiracial democracy. And that should motivate all of us. And in different language, and only in my mind, slightly different language, we're really struggling to build Dr. Martin Luther King's beloved community. And that's worth fighting for. And that's going to have democracy at its core. In that fight, right, there are going to be particular front lines that we're going to have to be giving special attention to. One of those front lines is criminal accountability for crimes that are committed, right? The people who were going to be attacking the governor were properly tried and some number of them properly convicted by juries. I think everybody who committed crimes in the attack on democracy need to be held accountable. Without accountability, you create this culture of impunity, which exists in a number of different countries. We need to be fighting misinformation and disinformation, right? We really are in a struggle for truth, a struggle for facts. We need to create healthy local news ecosystems, right? We're suffering from a lack of reporting on governments, a lack of local reporting, and Michigan has not taken actions as dramatically on that front as it has to protect voter rights. We have to understand the many ways that our public schools are under attack. And I mentioned some of these before: efforts to privatize charter schools, public money for religious schools, the effort to undermine the ability of public schools to be training citizenship by teaching them the basic history of this country as it relates to race relations. The schools are charged with creating our future citizens. And when we disrupt our public education, we're also undermining democracy, because we're undermining the literacy that our citizens need for future actions. Right. Some of this is just going back to that sort of counter-enlightenment movement. The founding of this country, the founding fathers had a clear separation of church and state. A lot of the realms of that separation are being eroded. And that is not going to be healthy for democracy. We have to reinvigorate civil society, right? That whole space of the public sphere. What does it mean to have social groups? What does it mean to have clubs? What does it mean to have groups like the League of Women Voters, and how important that aspect of civil society is? We have to invest in what sociologists call bridging forms of social capital. We have to be able to connect with people who are not like this. We have to have cross-community relationship building. We have to have a political and public policy agenda that's meeting the needs of rural Michigan, right? We have to make sure that Northern Michigan feels just as heard as Western Michigan and Southern Michigan. We have to make sure that our cities are being heard and represented, and that we have social policy agendas that are meeting the needs of the citizens in our cities. But a lot of that means we have to start bridging differences, right? We have to have cross-community relationships, and groups like We the People of Michigan are doing good work in that respect. I want to end where I began, right? That we can never talk about democracy without talking about voting rights. And we can never talk about voting rights without talking about democracy. And our democracy, sadly, is under attack. And we have to be coming to the defense of democracy at multiple levels. If you don't have democracy, there's nothing to vote for. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hammer. Ruth, did you have some questions?
You know, I don't have any yet. Maybe folks are still cogitating a little. Maybe one thing I wondered about as you were talking, and it's kind of far outside of what you were saying, but I remember conversations with my mother talking about a law that changed maybe in the 70s or 80s that allowed some of the different tribalism, as you're talking about, some of the different facts to start coming up. I wonder if you're familiar with that? Like, she was saying that it was something that changed, that allowed basically Fox News to exist.
Yeah, so at the beginning of a lot of broadcast regulation was created what they call the Fairness Doctrine. And the Fairness Doctrine was saying, if you're raising an issue of substantial public importance, you had to present both sides, right? So if you presented only one, you had an obligation to provide airtime to provide the other. I'm not sure if it was the late 70s or maybe the 80s. I've always associated the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine with Ronald Reagan, right? And sort of a lot of Reagan era policies. But your mother's very wise, right? So when you got rid of the Fairness Doctrine, you could have a radio station, sort of the precursors of Rush Limbaugh, that told you only one side of a story, right? And that would no longer raise issues with the license of that radio station with the Federal Communications Commission. And so post the elimination of the Fairness Doctrine, you have seen a greater polarization of media on all sides, right? But just as Yochai Benkler and that network propaganda book shows, the polarization is more extreme on the right than the left, right? And I say that as an empirical description of what my interpretation of the literature, not just an opinion, right? And I want to sort of make clear, sometimes I do tell you my opinion, and when I do tell you my opinion, I want you to know it's my opinion, but that's my best effort to report the research that I've seen.
Yeah, we have a question that's come in. This presentation helped me to think about the aspect of community when considering common facts. I noticed Judge Keith's writing was a dissent on the Ohio case. I wonder maybe if there's a way that you could share, is there a way that we could read that dissent in totality?
Yeah,
do you know?
I'd love to share you the whole opinion, because then under the fairness doctrine, you can read the majority, right? And then the two judges there, and you can read Judge Keith's dissent. So I think I love it when people want to read stuff. So I know we're being co-sponsored by the library, which just gives me chills, that I'd be happy to provide the sponsor of this event with a clean copy of the opinion. One of the reasons that, with the judge's passing, if anybody knew the judge, I'm sure that some number of people here did know the judge. He was larger than life, right? So you never thought there'd be a time when Judge Keith would not be with us. Of course, that's not true, but that's just kind of the feeling that he gave you. And so since his passing, I've taken on a greater sense of responsibility for carrying on his legacy. So this whole notion of letting people read his opinion. That's one thing I wanted to include his words here, that people can hear his words in that sense to be able to have that influence continue on. So I'd be very happy to share the written opinion with people.
And it being a dissent means that he was in the minority.
Yeah, so you're exactly right. And part of the sadness of his career, I mean, you got to remember, he was appointed to the bench in 1967 by Lyndon Baines Johnson, right? So that's a long time ago. And when he started his career, he was part of the majority. But going back again, if you think about Reagan as a sea change, both in economic policy, but in social policy, when you had the rise of the Federalist Society that's been in the news a lot in recent years, and you had a much clearer political litmus test on who would or would not be appointed by Republicans to federal judgeships. And I'm not saying there's not politics on the Democratic side, but there was a much more coordinated and specific set of filters that were set on the right, that you saw a substantial change in the politics of the judiciary. And I'm using those two words in the same sentence, the politics of the judiciary, in ways that by the time the Judge Keith ended his career, he was more often writing dissents, right, than majority opinions. And that didn't mean that Judge Keith had changed in his beliefs over the 52 years that he was on the bench, but rather the broader complexion of the judiciary had changed substantially from, sort of the Warren Court era legacy of progressive changes to the court that is, going even further and further, in my opinion, advertising my opinion, in much more sort of conservative and formalistic and ways that are not necessarily consistent with the law or the precedents.
Yeah. We have a question about if the slides might be available later. For sure that the recording will be available later and in that format. Would you mind sharing also the slides?
As I like to remind people, I'm a public employee at a public institution. And so I feel a particular responsibility to be sharing the information in ways for anybody. If you want to criticize it and pick it apart, great. If people want to share it with others, to share some of these lessons. I do really believe, I think you got a sense of this, that our democracy is under siege in ways that we don't even really understand and appreciate fully, right? And then we got to move far beyond the headlines. The headlines are just sort of the tip of the icebergs I was talking about, but really understanding the why question, right? People don't become fertile ground for these kind of changes overnight, right? And that's why I was going back to the work of Angus Deacon and his wife Ann Case, to that deaths of despair, right? That sort of canary in the coal mine, that there really has been an underappreciated set of changes that have affected the whole country. So I don't want to give white people a pass, but I think that there are ways in which they have responded to that, not only ways that have increased suicide and addiction, but of also ways that have created a mindset that make them more vulnerable to some of these racialized stories of nostalgia and redemption and blaming others as a placeholder for the resentment that they're feeling. And so I just say we need to think a whole lot much harder about this. Because we used to have a container of democracy where our fights over voting rights really were our fights over democracy, right? And now when we don't have that container and we really don't have that public sphere, we could have the strongest voting rights in the history, and we could still have militia movements that are using non-democratic means, non-political means to be advancing various forms of social change. So that's why we have to not only be worried about the voting rights, which are essential, I mean, obviously for all democracies, but we have to worry about the democracy itself.
Yeah. Another question. Do you know
Ruth,
that
may I come in? I shared the link to the YouTube channel again. It will be a couple of weeks before it's there, but that's the link to where all of our League of Women Voters programs are.
Great, thank you. Do you know of any groups that are working to bridge the discussion in Michigan? And if there are any, what are they doing?
Yeah, so I lifted up the work of We the People of Michigan as one particular example. Also, I think some of the work on the anti-criminalization, like Michigan Liberation, has been also trying to create broader coalitions. But on We the People of Michigan, there's a national movement to engage what people are calling race-class narratives, and even moving now to race-class gender narratives, to be trying to find out what's in common. And I've been trying to read different ethnographies about growing up in rural America. And when I hear that, they feel alienated, right? They feel that the government doesn't understand them or listen to them. They feel like the policies are not directed at what their needs are. And that's just what I hear in Detroit, right? People in Detroit feel alienated, right? They feel like the government is not responding to their needs. They feel like some of their basic desires and services are not being fulfilled. So I think there's that notion that if we are having these cross-community relationships, if we're willing to actually spend time with each other and listen to each other, we're going to find that there's a lot more in common, right? And so one tactic that We the People of Michigan uses is what they call deep canvassing. So, you know, canvassing, you knock on the door, you talk to people for 20 minutes, you have your goods you're trying to sell, right? Which is fine. That's how we do our democracy on all sides. The deep canvassing really is there to listen. Right, so a series of questions that are designed to elucidate what are your concerns, right? What are your hopes, right? What are your aspirations, in a way that they can better understand and start a conversation, right? I teach a course on movement lawyering, and we were showing the students last week Grace Lee Boggs' documentary, American Revolutionary, and what gets talked about, there's this notion of just conversation, right? And the importance of conversation. And so part of deep canvassing is just creating a relationship through a conversation between two people who don't know each other and come from different backgrounds. And it's really as fundamental as that. But you can imagine that, you know, having field trips for school kids, you know, home and away, that Detroit, you know, let's go out to Hudson, Michigan, right? And or Hillsdale, Michigan, and let's have high school kids from Hillsdale come and visit Birmingham or you know, Detroit or Cass Tech, you know. Is that kind of notion. And I think Michigan can model that, right? That's just hearkening back to what's best in all of us, right? You know, there's a lot in this country that we can and should be proud of, but we got to reclaim that. And that's why I loved the introductory comment that none of this is a spectator sport. And I think these organizations, the League of Women Voters is great at modeling that, but they might think about other ways, right, that they could be doing what that bridging social capital is, and those cross-community of relationship building, and you might be in a position to be contributing to those conversations.
Yeah, I believe last spring we had a presenter on deep canvassing. Actually, it was an
Love
interesting
that.
too. So if you go to the YouTube channel, you'll find that one there.
I will do that.
What are you seeing from the students in college in terms of how they look at democracy? Do you see any like trends there?
I think there's things to be excited about this generation. I think there's things to be worried about this generation. On the excited part, you know, all these sort of othering bugaboos, you know, whether it's race, whether it's sexual orientation, whether it's gender, you know, identity, they don't care, right? It's just not high on their list of things that are keeping them up at night and making them worried. At the same time, you know, a lot of these people, and I'm going to talk about the law students, come to Wayne State Law School in the largest Black majority city, having been raised in the region and have no connection to the city, right? So there are ways in which that kind of hyper isolation, where you no longer have to be crossing certain geographic and social boundaries, is actually, I think, in some ways sharper today than it was even a few generations ago, which you wouldn't think, right? You think that we are, becoming more global citizens, and these barriers are becoming less important. But in a lot of ways, we've created isolated, sheltered communities that we're raising our youth in that don't necessarily give them the personal experience. And personal experience is everything, right? If you're not building real relationships, if you're not meeting people as people, then everything's an abstraction. And it's very hard to understand people as abstractions.
And then looks like maybe a last question. What, in your opinion, can we do about voter apathy?
Yeah, no, again, great questions. People always talk about, the election of Mike Duggan in Detroit, a white mayor and a majority Black city. But Mayor Duggan won 2/3 of the vote, which is great, but only 16% of the people voted, right? So, what's 2/3 of 16? That ain't much, right? And that should cause anybody, right? Duggan opponents, Republicans, Democrats, to worry. And I'm sure some of the people in listening to this conversation know better than I, but I've heard conversations between grandparents in Detroit and grandchildren in Detroit about voting, right? And the grandparents are coming from, more of the Judge Keith generation of folks that were grown up fighting to vote, fighting for the right to vote, dying for the right to vote. And I just said, nothing got Judge Keith more angry than voter decisions, right? And you just sort of see how deeply embedded in his DNA that was. And yet their grandchildren say, government's never done anything for me, right? There's nothing they can point to in their lives that's been made better by anything you could have voted for. And so that deep alienation is something that is understandable, right? And so the question is, how do you make government meaningful, right? How do you make it something that will inspire them? I sometimes think that you need civic engagement as a stepping stone to the ballot box, because once you get civically engaged, you start to understand the importance of policy. And once you start to understand the importance of policy, then the need to vote becomes much more logical and self-motivated. But I would first say that the alienation is understandable, right? The alienation is often justified. So you have to sort of go to the core of what that is the cause of, and then, be able to work to get people to have different sets of life experiences and different sets of values and beliefs that make it logical for them to want to vote.
And we're getting a few more in, you're getting more questions out there. Is getting the unhoused easier to register? Is it getting easier to get the unhoused registered and voting? And I guess maybe you can separate that from Michigan as well as like maybe on a national scale.
Yeah, so I'm just so happy about those 3 ballot initiatives. My ability to sleep at night, my sort of pride in my state, my belief in the sort of infrastructure and democracy is much stronger here, and it does make it easier. But you see, it's often the sort of devil's in the details, right? So that notion of people poo-pooing, well, of course you got to have the same name on both. It's got to be spelled the same way. But if people are struggling with different mental health issues, if people are struggling with literacy issues, it's very easy to understand where subpopulations are going to face more challenges on the weeds, right? And I don't think we've done enough in Michigan to necessarily get down at the weeds, right? To make sure that the actual administrative process of voting and the mechanics has that compassion, has that understanding. It was the way they restricted in Ohio was the ability of poll workers to help them, right? So that whole basic ability to empower poll workers with some discretion and autonomy to be able to help people with needs. So I think that we still have work to do on that level, and I think the sort of reminding ourselves of the diversity of the nature of the populace that we want to have voting means that we've got a whole lot more work to do than the great progress we've made on a lot of the constitutional amendments.
Yeah, and someone would like to know more about the center, the Keith Center.
Yeah, so I'll make this brief because I could talk for hours about the center, but the most important thing to know about the center is that we view spatial structural racism as our generation's primary civil rights challenge, right? So we've constructed a broad analysis of the way that spatial structural racism functions in Detroit. That's been done through community engaged processes. And then we apply that to the issue of the day. So what does that mean for emergency management? What did that mean for bankruptcy? What does that mean for water shutoffs? What does that mean for the state of public education? What does that mean for democracy? So we really think that we're ground zero for spatial structural racism. I sometimes say we're the new Selma. And if we don't act with the same intentionally as Selma acted and triggered about voting rights, right, in 1965, to be fighting against spatial structural racism and creating opportunity for all, regardless of what zip code they're born in, then we should be judged by future generations, right? Because that is our primary task, and that's the sort of primary mission of the Key Center.
And do you have lectures and presentations that the public can attend or anything?
Yeah, so the thing I would direct you to is we have a great program called the Detroit Equity Action Lab. And if people want to learn more about our community fronting of endeavors, they should go to detroitequity.org. So just go to detroitequity.org, check out the Detroit Equity Action Lab, and you'll really see, I think, an exciting portfolio program that we're doing in collaboration with community to be addressing spatial structural racism.
Yeah, like that. Cool. I think,
and I had a fairly long question that Kay Fields sent directly to me.
Okay.
And rather than trying to read it to you, I thought that I would ask Kay Fields to unmute.
Wonderful.
Oh my goodness, I was not expecting that. Good evening.
It was a long question.
Okay, thank you for that great presentation. My presentation, my question was regarding transparency and accountability, which I think is a part of active citizenship. And so we spend all this time trying to get people registered to vote, and then they vote, and then they walk away and go back to their lives. So I just was curious about your thoughts on active citizenship and how that can protect the democracy. Thank you.
Yeah. No, great questions. And I agree. It really is. You go back to that notion of the public sphere or civil society. The people have to be engaged and have to be engaged, 24/7. This is not, once every 4 years, once every 2 years, once every election cycle. But there's got to be something meaningful for them to do. Nobody joins a club that doesn't respond to their needs. So coming back, that idea of how would we reinvigorate civil society? What would it take in Detroit to create spaces that are meeting people's needs? Recreational space is a huge need, right? And so, and that gets people together, gets them outside, gets them interacting. So basic things such as making sure we have a safe and plentiful recreational spaces, not just Detroit, but everywhere. Schools are critical, right? So engagement in schools, making schools a center of communities. So it's not just maybe the education, but that's also the midnight basketball, but that's also adult education, and that's also wraparound services with state social service support. So I think we have to think really hard about how we are meeting people's needs, right? Because it's when you're meeting people's needs and you're giving them an opportunity to act on their own behalf in addressing the needs of themselves and others, that trigger of civil society gets sparked, right? And that's why I was alluding to earlier, that I think it's that kind of activity that are going to get people to voting box, right? That kind of notion of first being civically engaged, confronting issues you care about. That leads to an awareness of policy and the importance of policy. That leads to the awareness of saying, I really do have to care about what's happening at City Hall. I have to care about what's happening in Lansing. I got to care about who my congresswoman is.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Hammer. This was very informative. I wanted to let people know we had to cancel our March program because the U.S. Supreme Court case Moore v. Harper was withdrawn for reconsideration in North Carolina. So we decided not to have a program about it. This case involves the question of whether state legislatures have authority over election matters, overriding the courts. If this case reaches the national level again, we hope to address the question with Dr. Evan Kaminker, who is going to speak for us in March. And next month, we plan to address the issue of prison gerrymandering, where the Census Bureau counts incarcerated people in their site of imprisonment rather than in their home counties. So we will have representatives of the organization Voting Access for All to explore the issue and the proposed bill to be addressed by the state legislature in June. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Dr. Hammer. Thank you, Ruth and Cheryl, as always, for helping make things work.
Wonderful. Have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, you too.
Great.
Thank you.